Every time someone smashes a bus stop window or spray paints a wall for no reason, the news calls it vandalism. Almost nobody using that word today knows where it actually comes from. The real story isn't random destruction at all. It's a 14-day operation so disciplined, so methodically organized, that it looked less like a riot and more like a corporate audit with swords. A pope walked out of Rome's gates, unarmed, to negotiate with a king everyone expected to burn the city to the ground. What he got instead was something far stranger: a deal, a schedule, and a tribe that would spend the next 15 centuries wrongly blamed for smashing art they'd actually just quietly stolen. Long before their name became a byword for mindless destruction, the Vandals were simply one of dozens of Germanic peoples occupying the borderlands of the Roman world, a confederation with origins traced by most historians to the region spanning modern Poland and parts of Scandinavia, a population of farmers, herders, and warriors who had spent generations in the same uneasy, shifting relationship with Rome that characterized virtually every Germanic group along the empire's northern frontier, sometimes trading, sometimes fighting, sometimes serving as auxiliary troops within Rome's own armies, and always aware that the Roman world on the far side of the frontier represented both an existential threat and an almost unimaginable concentration of wealth. The event that transformed the Vandals from a regional Germanic confederation into one of the defining forces of late antique history was not, in its origins, a Vandal decision at all. It was a catastrophe imposed on them from the east. The Huns, the nomadic steppe confederation whose westward expansion across the 4th and early 5th centuries would eventually reshape the entire political geography of Europe, began pushing into the territories of various Germanic and Gothic peoples with a speed and violence that produced cascading waves of displacement. As one people fleeing the Huns collided with the territory of another, who in turn were forced to flee further west, in a chain reaction that historians studying this period increasingly describe less as a single migration than as a Europe-wide crisis of displaced populations searching for anywhere safer than where they currently stood. The Vandals, caught in this expanding wave of displacement, made a decision on the last day of December in 406 AD that would permanently alter the trajectory of the Western Roman Empire, though almost none of the participants could have understood the full consequences at the time. Together with allied Germanic groups including the Alans and the Suebi, the Vandals crossed the frozen Rhine River into Roman Gaul, modern France, taking advantage of the unusually severe winter that had frozen the river solid enough to bear the weight of an entire migrating population, wagons, livestock, and all. The Roman frontier defences along this stretch of the Rhine, already stretched thin by decades of accumulated military and financial strain, proved unable to prevent what amounted to a mass, uncontrolled population movement directly into the heart of Roman territory. What followed was not a single decisive campaign but a prolonged, grinding, multi-year migration through Roman territory, as the Vandals and their allies moved across Gaul and eventually into Spain, fighting Roman forces, rival Germanic groups, and local populations along the way, surviving through a combination of raiding, negotiated settlement, and outright conquest of territory that Roman authority proved increasingly unable to defend or reclaim. This period of the Vandals' history, years of displacement, warfare, and the accumulated hardship of moving an entire population, including women, children, and the elderly, across hostile and unfamiliar terrain, deserves particular attention because it complicates any simple narrative of the Vandals as purely predatory invaders. They were also, throughout this period, a people fleeing catastrophe, seeking security for their families in a world that offered them very few safe options. The decisive strategic transformation in Vandal history came under the leadership of a king named Genseric, who assumed leadership of the Vandal Confederation in 428 AD and would prove himself across the following decades, to be one of the most consistently shrewd and capable political and military strategists of the entire late Roman period, a judgment shared, notably, by contemporary Roman observers who despised him but could not deny his effectiveness. Genseric recognized what many of his contemporaries, both Roman and Germanic, had not yet fully grasped, that the Western Roman Empire's political fragmentation and chronic internal instability had created opportunities for a sufficiently disciplined and opportunistic power to seize genuinely transformative territorial gains, rather than simply raiding Roman territory for temporary plunder before eventually being absorbed, defeated, or pushed elsewhere. In 429 AD, Genseric led the Vandal population, reportedly numbering somewhere in the range of 80,000 people, including warriors, women, children, and dependents, though ancient population figures of this kind should always be treated with appropriate caution, across the Strait of Gibraltar from Spain into North Africa, a decision whose strategic brilliance would become fully apparent only in the following decade. North Africa was not simply additional territory. It was, in the specific context of the late Roman economic and administrative system, one of the most valuable regions the empire possessed, functioning as the primary grain-producing breadbasket that fed the city of Rome itself through a centuries-old system of state-organized grain shipments that Roman urban life and Roman political stability had come to depend upon absolutely. The conquest of North Africa proceeded with a combination of military pressure and negotiated settlement that reflected Genseric's characteristic strategic patience, culminating in 439 AD with the capture of Carthage, the great North African metropolis that had once rivaled Rome itself for Mediterranean dominance in the pre-Roman era, and that remained, even under centuries of Roman administration, one of the wealthiest and most strategically significant cities in the entire Western Mediterranean world. With Carthage secured, Genseric possessed something no other Germanic leader operating within the collapsing Western Roman world had yet achieved. Not simply a territorial kingdom carved from Roman land, but direct control over the specific economic lifeline that Roman political stability in the imperial capital itself depended upon most critically. What happened next revealed the full scope of Genseric's strategic ambition, and it is this development, more than the initial invasion of North Africa itself, that transformed the Vandals into a genuinely existential threat to Roman power, rather than simply another troublesome frontier kingdom. The Vandals, a people whose military tradition and cultural identity had been built entirely around mounted, land-based warfare during their long migration across Gaul and Spain, undertook the remarkable transformation of building and mastering a substantial war fleet, converting themselves within a relatively short span of years into one of the most feared naval powers in the entire Mediterranean basin. Vandal raiding fleets began striking coastal settlements across Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and the Italian mainland itself, targets that had for centuries considered themselves entirely secure from exactly this kind of seaborne threat, protected by Rome's historical naval dominance over Mediterranean waters that the empire's internal decline had now fatally compromised. By the early 450s, Genseric commanded not a displaced refugee population scrambling for survival, but a genuine Mediterranean maritime power, controlling North Africa's grain wealth, projecting naval force across the Western Mediterranean at will, and watching the Western Roman Empire's internal political structure disintegrate through a rapid, chaotic succession of weak emperors, court conspiracies, and assassinations that would, within the span of a single catastrophic year, finally provide him with the specific opportunity he had spent over 2 decades patiently positioning himself to exploit. It is worth pausing to consider just how remarkable this transformation actually was, in purely practical technical terms, since the leap from land-based mounted raiding to genuine naval mastery represented one of the more difficult institutional transitions any ancient or late antique people could attempt. Shipbuilding required specialized timber, skilled craftsmen, with knowledge the Vandals had no inherited tradition in producing themselves, and an entirely different category of military training focused on navigation, boarding tactics, and the specific rhythms of naval combat that bore little resemblance to the cavalry warfare the Vandals had practiced for generations. That Genseric managed to build this capacity essentially from nothing, and within roughly a decade, transform his kingdom into a naval power capable of successfully raiding across the length of the Western Mediterranean and eventually defeating a major Eastern Roman naval expedition outright, stands as one of the more underappreciated administrative and organizational achievements of the entire late antique period. A transformation historians studying comparable ancient state-building efforts have repeatedly singled out as evidence of just how genuinely exceptional Genseric's strategic and institutional capabilities actually were, regardless of the moral judgment one applies to the uses he ultimately put them toward. By 455 AD, the Western Roman Empire, that had once governed territory stretching from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to the Balkans, had contracted into something considerably smaller and more fragile than the imperial title still nominally suggested. A political entity whose actual administrative and military control extended reliably over little more than Italy itself, with even that core territory increasingly dependent on the loyalty and competence of powerful military commanders who frequently held more genuine authority than the emperors they nominally served. The emperor occupying the Western throne in this period was Valentinian III, a ruler whose reign had lasted an unusually long 3 decades by the standards of an era notorious for rapid imperial turnover, but whose personal political and military competence had never remotely matched the length of his tenure. Valentinian's actual survival and continued rule owed itself overwhelmingly to one man, Flavius Aetius, the brilliant general who had, among his other accomplishments, organized the coalition of Roman and allied Germanic forces that decisively halted Attila the Hun's invasion of Gaul at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 AD, one of the last genuinely significant Roman military victories of the Western Empire's final decades, and an achievement that had made Aetius, in the eyes of contemporaries, the single most important figure holding the collapsing Western Roman state together through sheer personal military and political competence. This achievement, rather than securing Aetius's position, ultimately proved fatal to him. Valentinian, whether from genuine paranoid fear that his own generals' accumulated prestige and military authority had grown dangerous enough to threaten the throne itself, or through the manipulations of court rivals who saw personal advantage in Aetius's removal, made the catastrophic decision in September of 454 AD to personally murder Aetius during a court audience, striking him down with his own hand, in a scene later Roman writers would describe with the kind of horrified fascination reserved for events widely recognized, even by contemporaries, as marking a genuine point of no return. A Roman commentator of the period is reported to have offered Valentinian a judgment that later history would prove devastatingly accurate, that in killing Aetius, the emperor had cut off his own right hand with his left. Without Aetius's military competence, political skill, and personal authority holding together the fragile coalition of Roman forces and allied Germanic contingents that had prevented total collapse throughout the preceding decades, the Western Roman state's remaining capacity for coordinated military and political response was left dangerously, perhaps fatally, diminished at precisely the moment such capacity would prove most urgently necessary. The murder produced immediate and violent consequences within Rome's own political elite. In March of 455 AD, barely 6 months after Aetius's death, Valentinian himself was assassinated, cut down by soldiers loyal to Aetius's memory and reportedly acting in coordination with, or at minimum with the tacit approval of, a wealthy and politically ambitious senator named Petronius Maximus, who moved with striking speed to claim the vacant imperial throne for himself in the immediate aftermath of Valentinian's death, a sequence of events compressed into a matter of months that left Roman political observers of the period reeling from the sheer velocity of the collapse in what had, for 3 decades, at least maintained a veneer of institutional stability. Petronius Maximus's seizure of power was accompanied by a further act of political consolidation that would prove, in retrospect, to be the single most consequential miscalculation of his brief and catastrophic reign. In order to legitimize his position and connect himself formally to the existing imperial dynasty, Petronius compelled Valentinian's widow, the Empress Licinia Eudoxia, into marriage with himself, a coerced union that historical sources uniformly describe as deeply unwelcome to Eudoxia, who found herself forced to marry the man widely believed responsible, whether directly or through complicity, for her previous husband's murder. Compounding Eudoxia's fury and desperation, Petronius additionally moved to dissolve an existing betrothal arrangement between Eudoxia's daughter, the Princess Eudocia, and Huneric, the son of the Vandal king Genseric, a diplomatic marriage alliance that had originally been negotiated as part of a broader effort to stabilize relations between the Western Roman court and the increasingly powerful Vandal Kingdom in North Africa. Petronius's decision to unilaterally cancel this arrangement, whatever his specific political calculations may have been, eliminated one of the few remaining diplomatic mechanisms binding Rome and the Vandal Kingdom together in anything resembling peaceful coexistence. Eudoxia, trapped in a marriage she despised, watching her daughter's diplomatic betrothal dissolved by the same man she held responsible for her first husband's death, and possessing intimate knowledge of court politics that made her acutely aware of just how militarily and politically vulnerable Rome had become in the aftermath of Aetius's murder, made a decision that ancient and modern historians alike have treated with considerable fascination as one of history's more dramatic acts of personal vengeance intersecting with genuine geopolitical consequence. She secretly dispatched a message across the Mediterranean to Carthage, appealing directly to King Genseric for military assistance against Petronius Maximus, whom she characterized in her appeal as a usurper and murderer from whom she urgently required rescue. Whatever combination of genuine desperation and calculated political maneuvering motivated Eudoxia's appeal, its practical effect was to hand Genseric precisely the diplomatic and political justification he had spent decades positioning himself to exploit. An empress of Rome herself, writing directly to request Vandal military intervention against what she characterized as an illegitimate usurper. This was not merely an excuse for opportunistic raiding, but a formal casus belli, of exactly the kind that ancient and medieval rulers relied upon to frame naked territorial and economic opportunism in terms of righteous, even chivalrous intervention. Genseric, according to every surviving account of his character and previous conduct, required no further encouragement. There is considerable scholarly debate about how much genuine weight to place on Eudoxia's appeal as the actual determining factor in Genseric's decision to sail for Rome, and this debate is worth acknowledging directly rather than glossing over. Some historians studying the period argue that Genseric's decades-long pattern of patient, opportunistic expansion makes it far more plausible that he was already planning some form of intervention against Rome's collapsing political order, regardless of any specific invitation, and that Eudoxia's message simply provided a convenient, retroactively useful justification for a decision his own strategic calculations had already made largely inevitable. Others take the ancient sources more literally, treating the Empress's appeal as the genuine proximate trigger without which the specific timing, if not the eventual inevitability, of the Vandal expedition might have unfolded differently. What both readings agree upon, and what matters most for understanding the sequence of events that followed, is that by the spring of 455, Genseric possessed both the capability and, through Eudoxia's message, a publicly defensible pretext to move against a city whose defences had collapsed as thoroughly and as rapidly as any capital in the ancient Mediterranean world ever had. News of the approaching Vandal fleet reached Rome with the particular, compounding terror that accompanies a threat everyone has long feared but never fully prepared for. Genseric's naval forces, drawing on the maritime capability the Vandal Kingdom had spent the previous decade and a half developing and refining through repeated raids across Sicily, Sardinia, and the broader western Mediterranean, assembled and departed from Carthage with a speed that left Roman authorities almost no meaningful window for organized defensive preparation, sailing directly toward the Italian coast and the mouth of the Tiber River that provided maritime access to Rome itself. The psychological impact of this approaching threat on the city's population deserves particular attention, because it illuminates just how thoroughly the Western Roman Empire's military and political authority had deteriorated by this point. Rome had not faced a genuine immediate threat of direct military assault in nearly half a century, since the Visigothic king Alaric's sack of the city in 410 AD, an earlier catastrophe that had itself sent shockwaves through the entire Mediterranean world, prompting the Christian theologian Augustine to compose his monumental work, The City of God, partly in response to the philosophical and theological crisis the city's fall had provoked. The prospect of a second such catastrophe, arriving so soon after the internal political chaos of Aetius's murder and Valentinian's assassination, had already left Roman governance in visible disarray, produced a wave of panic that contemporary accounts describe spreading through the city with the speed and intensity of an uncontrolled fire. Petronius Maximus, the senator who had seized the imperial throne barely months earlier through his complicity in Valentinian's assassination, now confronted the practical military reality that his brief reign had done nothing to address. Rome possessed no meaningful military force capable of resisting a determined Vandal assault. The Western Roman army, already severely weakened by decades of financial strain, territorial losses, and the specific catastrophic loss of Aetius's leadership and the loyal military forces his personal authority had commanded, offered Petronius no realistic prospect of organized armed resistance against Genseric's approaching fleet and the substantial land forces it carried. Faced with this reality, Petronius Maximus made a decision that ancient sources record with a consistent tone of contempt and moral condemnation, one that would define his brief reign in historical memory far more than any of his actual policy decisions during his months in power, rather than remaining in Rome to organize whatever defense remained possible, or to at minimum negotiate terms with the approaching Vandal force in his capacity as emperor. Petronius attempted to flee the city entirely, gathering what personal wealth and possessions he could, and preparing to abandon Rome's population to whatever fate awaited them at Vandal hands, apparently prioritizing his own personal survival over any conception of imperial duty or responsibility to the city and population he nominally ruled. The attempted flight proved fatally mistimed and poorly executed. As Petronius attempted to make his way out of the city, Roman citizens, already gripped by panic over the approaching Vandal threat, and now confronted with unmistakable visual confirmation that their emperor was abandoning them rather than organizing any form of defense or negotiated protection, recognized him in the streets and, in a spontaneous eruption of fury that historical accounts describe with vivid, disturbing specificity, set upon him directly. Petronius Maximus was killed by the mob, reportedly stoned to death in the open street by Roman citizens whose fear had curdled into violent rage against a ruler they now regarded as having betrayed them at the moment of the city's greatest need. His body, according to multiple ancient sources, was subsequently mutilated by the same crowd and thrown into the Tiber River, denied even the basic dignity of formal burial that Roman custom would ordinarily have extended even to a deposed and despised ruler. This left Rome, in the days immediately preceding Genseric's arrival, in a condition of almost complete political and military vacuum. No functioning emperor, no organized military command structure capable of mounting resistance, and a civilian population left entirely without effective leadership or protection, precisely as an experienced, battle-tested Vandal fleet approached the mouth of the Tiber and began landing forces at the port city of Ostia, Rome's traditional maritime gateway, situated close enough to the capital that Genseric's army faced no meaningful obstacle to advancing directly on the city itself within a matter of days. Rome's famous defensive walls, the Aurelian Walls, constructed in the 3rd century AD, and expanded and reinforced repeatedly in the centuries since, representing one of the most formidable pieces of urban fortification anywhere in the ancient world, remained, in a purely physical sense, entirely intact and imposing. But walls without defenders manning them represented, as military history has repeatedly demonstrated across countless sieges throughout human history, little more than an impressive but ultimately hollow perimeter. With no organized garrison prepared to resist an assault, with the city's political leadership dead in the streets or scattered in the chaos of the preceding days, and with a veteran Vandal army under Genseric's personal command advancing steadily from Ostia, Rome faced the prospect of falling not through any dramatic siege or military breakthrough, but through the simple, brutal reality that there was no longer anyone left with the authority or capacity to organize its defense. In the absence of any functioning secular political or military authority capable of responding to the approaching Vandal threat, the task of representing Rome's interests, and quite possibly determining the physical fate of hundreds of thousands of civilian inhabitants, fell to a figure whose institutional authority derived from an entirely different source than the collapsed imperial government. Pope Leo I, the Bishop of Rome, whose position within the increasingly Christianized late Roman world had by this period accumulated genuine practical political influence extending well beyond its formal religious mandate. Leo was not, by the time Genseric's forces approached Rome in 455 AD, an inexperienced or untested figure suddenly thrust into an unfamiliar diplomatic role. 3 years earlier, in 452 AD, he had already demonstrated a capacity for exactly this kind of high-stakes personal diplomacy under conditions of extreme danger, when he had travelled personally to meet with Attila the Hun during the Hunnic invasion of Italy, participating in negotiations that historical tradition credits, alongside other practical military and logistical factors that likely also influenced Attila's decision, with persuading the Hunnic king to withdraw his forces from Italian territory rather than advancing on Rome itself. Whatever combination of Leo's personal persuasive authority and Attila's own independent strategic calculations actually produced that earlier withdrawal, the episode had established Leo's reputation, both within Rome and among the broader constellation of Germanic and other powers observing Roman affairs, as a figure capable of successful, high-stakes negotiation with even the most formidable and unpredictable military leaders of the period. With Rome now facing an even more immediately dangerous threat, and with no emperor, no functioning military command, and no other figure of comparable authority available to represent the city's interests, Leo once again took on the extraordinarily dangerous personal responsibility of walking out from Rome's gates, unarmed and accompanied only by a small delegation, to meet directly with Genseric and his assembled forces before the Vandal army could begin its assault on the city itself. The specific content of the negotiation that followed has been reconstructed by historians primarily through later Christian sources, particularly the account preserved by the historian Prosper of Aquitaine, writing not long after the events themselves, though modern historians studying this period generally note that the precise details of what was actually said in these negotiations cannot be established with complete certainty, given the inherent limitations of the surviving sources and their evident interest in presenting Leo's role in the most favourable possible light. What the broader historical consensus does accept, based on the consistency of the surviving accounts and the observable outcome that followed, is that some form of genuine negotiated agreement was reached between Leo and Genseric, an agreement whose terms, whatever the precise language in which they were originally framed, established the specific conditions under which the sack of Rome would actually proceed. The core of this agreement, as historians have reconstructed it from the available evidence, involved a calculated trade that reflected Genseric's own pragmatic priorities as much as any purely humanitarian concession on his part. Genseric agreed that his forces would not set fire to the city's buildings and would refrain from the kind of indiscriminate massacre of the civilian population that had characterized certain other instances of ancient and late antique urban conquest, including elements of the earlier Visigothic sack of the city under Alaric in 410 AD. In exchange, the city's gates would be opened to Vandal forces, who would then be permitted to conduct a systematic, unopposed plundering of the city's accumulated wealth over a specified period, generally recorded in the historical tradition as 14 days. It is worth pausing to consider the specific strategic logic that likely made this arrangement genuinely attractive to Genseric, beyond whatever persuasive power Leo's personal authority and reputation may have carried into the negotiation. Genseric was not, by this point in his long and consistently pragmatic career, a leader primarily motivated by destruction for its own sake, or by the kind of uncontrolled battlefield fury that might make negotiated restraint difficult to secure. He was, as his entire prior career of calculated territorial conquest and strategic alliance building had repeatedly demonstrated, a ruler focused overwhelmingly on tangible, extractable value, precisely the kind of leader for whom a negotiated agreement guaranteeing systematic, unopposed access to the city's movable wealth, in exchange for restraint that cost him nothing of genuine strategic value, represented an entirely rational and attractive proposition. A burned city yields less plunder than an intact one. A massacred population cannot be efficiently sorted for valuable captives worth ransoming or enslaving for their skills. Genseric's agreement to restraint, in other words, likely reflected calculated self-interest as much as any deference to Leo's moral authority, even as Christian historical tradition would understandably emphasize the latter explanation in the centuries of retelling that followed. On June 2nd, 455 AD, in accordance with the negotiated terms, the gates of Rome, the gates of a city that had, at the height of its power centuries earlier, ruled the entire known Mediterranean world and beyond, were opened not through military breach, not through the collapse of its formidable walls under siege engines or sustained assault, but through deliberate, negotiated capitulation arranged by a religious leader acting in the near-total absence of any surviving secular authority capable of making the decision himself. The Vandal army that subsequently entered the city did so, according to multiple surviving accounts, with a notable and, to contemporary Roman observers, almost unsettling degree of order and discipline, marching in organized formation rather than surging forward in the kind of chaotic, uncontrolled rush that popular imagination typically associates with a conquering barbarian horde. The broader significance of Leo's role in this episode deserves emphasis beyond the immediate practical outcome of the negotiation itself, because it marks a genuinely important moment in the longer historical development of papal authority within the city of Rome, and, eventually, within the wider Christian world. In the near-total absence of functioning secular imperial government, it was the Bishop of Rome, not any surviving military commander or civil magistrate, who possessed both the personal courage and the accumulated institutional credibility to walk out and negotiate directly with an approaching conqueror on behalf of the city's population, a role that imperial officials, in earlier centuries when Roman government still functioned with genuine coherence and capability, would have handled through conventional diplomatic and military channels entirely disconnected from ecclesiastical authority. Historians studying the gradual, centuries-long process by which the papacy accumulated genuine temporal political influence within Rome and eventually within the wider Italian peninsula frequently point to episodes exactly like this one, moments of secular governmental collapse, in which the Church's leadership stepped into a vacuum no one else remained capable of filling. As critical, formative steps in that longer institutional development, one that would eventually culminate, centuries later, in the papacy's emergence as a genuine independent, temporal power in its own right, ruling the Papal States as a distinct political entity alongside its religious authority. What followed over the subsequent 2 weeks would come to be remembered, and eventually mythologized, as one of history's defining acts of civilizational destruction. Yet the actual historical record, when examined carefully against the popular legend that later centuries constructed around it, reveals something considerably more methodical, more administratively disciplined, and in certain specific respects, more genuinely restrained than the chaotic, indiscriminate rampage that the word derived from this event would eventually come to represent in common usage. The comparison historians frequently draw, and one worth examining directly, is between the Vandal sack of 455 and the earlier Visigothic sack of Rome under Alaric in 410 AD. Alaric's forces, entering the city after a prolonged and increasingly desperate siege that had already reduced much of Rome's population to conditions of genuine starvation, conducted a sack characterized by contemporary accounts as considerably more chaotic and violent, involving significant civilian casualties, widespread burning of buildings, and the kind of disorganized, opportunistic looting that typically accompanies a city falling to sustained military assault after a prolonged and bitter siege. The Vandal sack, by contrast, proceeded according to what several historians studying the surviving accounts have specifically characterized as an almost bureaucratic, administrative logic, plunder conducted not as chaotic pillaging, but as something closer to a systematic, organized extraction operation. Genseric's forces began with the most obvious and symbolically significant target available, the imperial palace complex on the Palatine Hill, the traditional residence of Roman emperors and the physical seat of imperial authority for centuries, which Vandal soldiers proceeded to systematically strip of every item of gold, silver, and precious material it contained, working through the palace's extensive chambers and treasuries with what surviving accounts describe as thorough, methodical attention rather than the kind of frenzied, disorganized grabbing that popular imagination typically associates with a conquering army's initial entry into a captured city. From the palace, Vandal forces spread systematically through the residences of Rome's remaining senatorial aristocracy and other wealthy households, conducting what amounted to organized searches for hidden valuables, precious metals, jewelry, fine furnishings, and other movable wealth that Rome's elite families had accumulated across generations, some of it likely concealed in anticipation of exactly this kind of catastrophe, given how thoroughly the previous decades had already established Rome's vulnerability to exactly this category of threat. The thoroughness with which Vandal soldiers apparently conducted these searches, working through household after household with sustained attention over multiple days rather than a single chaotic rush, reinforces the broader characterization of this operation as fundamentally extractive and administrative in its underlying logic, rather than driven primarily by uncontrolled destructive impulse. Even Rome's Christian churches, institutions that might reasonably have expected some degree of religious deference or restraint from a plundering force, given that the Vandals themselves, while adherents of Arian Christianity rather than the Nicene Christianity dominant in Rome, were nonetheless a professedly Christian people rather than pagan raiders operating entirely outside any shared religious framework, received no meaningful exemption from the systematic extraction underway throughout the city. Gold and silver liturgical vessels, ornamental crosses set with precious stones, and other portable ecclesiastical wealth were removed from Rome's major churches alongside the treasures taken from secular palaces and aristocratic households, a detail that later Christian historians recording these events would understandably find particularly troubling to reconcile with the Vandals' own professed Christian identity. However doctrinally distinct their specific Arian beliefs remained from Roman Catholic orthodoxy. The physical logistics required to actually transport the sheer accumulated volume of plunder being systematically extracted from the city over this 2-week period represented a genuinely substantial undertaking in its own right, one that further underscores just how organized and premeditated this operation actually was, rather than representing spontaneous, opportunistic looting improvised on the spot by soldiers encountering wealth they had not specifically anticipated or prepared to transport. Vandal forces brought with them substantial numbers of wagons and carts, specifically intended and equipped for the purpose of hauling accumulated treasure from throughout the city down to waiting ships at the port of Ostia, a logistical operation that required careful coordination, sustained organized labor, and precisely the kind of disciplined military command structure that a purely chaotic, uncontrolled rampage would have been entirely incapable of sustaining across a full 14 days of continuous, systematic operation. Surviving accounts specifically describe plundered valuables being weighed, catalogued, and formally divided among Genseric's forces according to established shares and hierarchical rank before being loaded onto the waiting ships for transport back to Carthage, an administrative process that, whatever moral judgment one applies to the underlying act of systematic theft from a conquered civilian population, reflects a level of organizational discipline and logistical planning considerably closer to a structured resource extraction operation than to the popular image of drunken, disorganized barbarian pillaging that later centuries would come to associate with the Vandal name specifically, and with Germanic conquest of Rome more generally. The comparison to a modern administrative or logistical operation is not simply a rhetorical flourish adopted for dramatic effect within this retelling. Historians who have studied the specific mechanics Genseric's forces are described as having employed, the systematic house-by-house searches conducted in organized sequence rather than chaotic simultaneous rushing, the formal weighing and cataloguing of recovered valuables before distribution, the coordinated scheduling of wagon transport to the port, matched against the pace of ongoing collection throughout the city, the maintenance of discipline sufficient to prevent the kind of internal fighting over particularly valuable individual items that frequently erupted among less organized plundering forces in other documented instances of ancient urban conquest, have repeatedly noted that this level of coordinated logistical management across a full 2 weeks of continuous operation would have required a genuinely sophisticated command structure, one considerably more developed than the loosely organized warbands that popular imagination typically associates with Germanic military forces of this period. Genseric's Vandal Kingdom, by 455, had spent over 2 decades developing precisely this kind of administrative capacity, first in governing conquered North African territory, and then in organizing repeated, sustained naval raiding campaigns across the Western Mediterranean, capacity that the Rome operation drew upon directly, applying institutional lessons learned across multiple prior campaigns to what remains, even by the standards of ancient conquest more broadly, an unusually well-organized instance of large-scale urban plunder. Beyond the systematic collection of portable gold, silver, and precious materials that characterized the early stages of the sack, Genseric's forces demonstrated a further dimension of methodical, calculated extraction that extended into the physical architectural fabric of the city itself, a practice that, while certainly destructive to the specific buildings involved, reflected the same fundamentally acquisitive, rather than purely destructive underlying logic that had characterized the operation from its outset. The Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, one of ancient Rome's most religiously and symbolically significant structures, having served for centuries as the preeminent temple of the Roman state religion before the empire's Christianization in the 4th century, had reduced its active religious function while leaving its physical structure and accumulated material wealth largely intact, received particular attention from Vandal forces specifically interested in the building's roof, which was constructed using bronze tiles that had, according to the ancient sources describing this period, been coated or gilded with gold. Rather than simply damaging or destroying this roof in place, Vandal soldiers systematically dismantled and removed the valuable roofing material, extracting the underlying precious metal content for transport back to Carthage, an operation requiring the same kind of sustained, organized labor as the collection of portable treasures from palaces and private residences, and one that again underscores the extractive rather than purely destructive character of the overall operation. It is at this point in the historical record that a particularly significant and frequently misunderstood detail deserves direct attention, since it bears directly on the later, largely inaccurate popular understanding of what the Vandals actually did to Rome's abundant artistic heritage during this period. Contrary to the popular image that would eventually attach itself to the Vandal name, of a horde systematically smashing and destroying the classical statuary and artistic monuments that filled Rome's public spaces and private collections, the actual historical evidence suggests something considerably different in both method and underlying motivation. Genseric's forces did not, according to the weight of surviving historical evidence, engage in systematic destruction of Rome's marble statuary and artistic monuments. Instead, valuable and aesthetically prized works of sculpture were carefully removed, packed, and transported back to Carthage, where Genseric intended them to serve as decorative and prestige objects adorning his own royal capital, in much the same way that Roman generals across preceding centuries had themselves systematically looted the artistic treasures of conquered Greek cities and other subjugated territories to adorn Rome itself. This distinction matters considerably for understanding the actual historical character of the event, as later episodes in this series will explore in greater detail regarding how thoroughly the popular understanding of vandalism diverges from the documented historical conduct of the people the term was eventually named after. Valuable art, in Genseric's calculated priorities, represented transportable wealth and prestige value worth the considerable additional effort of careful packing and shipping, not worthless material deserving casual destruction. A smashed statue served no one's practical interest. A stolen statue, carefully transported and prominently displayed in Carthage, served Genseric's interest in establishing his new capital as a genuine rival to Rome's accumulated cultural and artistic prestige. Among the various categories of plundered wealth removed from Rome during this 14-day operation, one specific category of treasure carries particular historical resonance and a genuinely remarkable backstory extending back nearly 4 centuries before the Vandal sack itself. Sacred objects originally looted from the Second Temple in Jerusalem by Roman forces under the future Emperor Titus following the suppression of the Jewish revolt in 70 AD, including, according to multiple historical accounts, the golden menorah and other ceremonial vessels that had been proudly displayed in Rome for centuries afterward, as trophies commemorating that earlier Roman military triumph, famously depicted being carried in procession on the Arch of Titus, a monument that still stands in Rome today. These specific sacred objects, having already survived one act of conquest-driven displacement from Jerusalem to Rome under Titus, were now removed a second time, carried across the Mediterranean to Carthage as part of Genseric's accumulated plunder, a detail that adds a genuinely striking layer of historical irony and continuity to the broader story, illustrating how the same category of sacred, symbolically loaded treasure could be repeatedly displaced across centuries and across entirely different conquering powers, each treating the same objects as legitimate spoils of their own particular military triumph, entirely disconnected from whatever religious or cultural significance those objects had originally carried for the community that first created and venerated them. Beyond these more spectacular and historically resonant categories of plunder, Vandal forces also engaged in the systematic stripping of bronze fittings and fixtures from public buildings and monuments throughout the city, material intended not for display or prestige purposes, but for practical, functional reuse, melted down in Carthage to produce weapons, tools, and coinage for the Vandal Kingdom's own ongoing economic and military needs. Even everyday bronze and copper cooking vessels from ordinary Roman households, items possessing negligible individual value but representing, in aggregate across thousands of households, a genuinely significant quantity of usable raw material, were reportedly collected and removed by Vandal forces during this period, a detail that underscores just how thoroughly and systematically the entire operation extended beyond aristocratic treasure into the practical material fabric of ordinary Roman domestic life. For Genseric, the systematic extraction of Rome's accumulated gold, silver, art, and material wealth represented only one dimension of what he understood the sack's strategic value to encompass. Human beings, captives possessing specific skills, social status, or simple economic value as enslaved labor, constituted an equally significant category of plunder, one that Genseric pursued with the same calculated, methodical attention that characterized every other aspect of his 14-day operation within the city. The most politically significant captives taken during this period were, unsurprisingly, members of the imperial family itself. Empress Licinia Eudoxia, whose own desperate appeal to Genseric had, in one of history's more consequential ironies, directly precipitated the very catastrophe now unfolding around her, was taken captive along with her two daughters, Eudocia and Placidia, the imperial women now finding themselves transported as prisoners to the very kingdom whose military intervention Eudoxia had personally solicited in her fury against Petronius Maximus. This outcome, whatever combination of naivety, desperation, or miscalculation, had actually motivated Eudoxia's original appeal for Vandal assistance, represents one of the more strikingly ironic reversals in the entire historical episode. A woman who had summoned a foreign king to rescue her from a usurper found herself, in the aftermath of that very intervention, a captive of the same king she had appealed to for salvation. Beyond the imperial family, Genseric's forces specifically targeted and captured individuals possessing skilled professional expertise that could prove genuinely valuable to the ongoing development and consolidation of the Vandal Kingdom in North Africa. Architects, engineers, skilled craftsmen, and educated professionals whose specialized knowledge represented, in Genseric's evidently calculated assessment, human capital worth forcibly acquiring and relocating to serve the practical needs of his own growing kingdom, which faced the ongoing challenge of developing and maintaining the kind of sophisticated urban infrastructure and administrative capacity that Roman civilization had spent centuries accumulating, and that a relatively young Germanic kingdom, however militarily and economically successful, could not simply generate from its own existing population alone. This specific detail, the deliberate, targeted capture of skilled professionals, rather than indiscriminate mass enslavement without regard to individual capability, further reinforces the broader characterization of Genseric's conduct throughout this entire episode as calculated and strategically purposeful, rather than driven by simple opportunistic greed or uncontrolled destructive impulse. A ruler interested merely in maximizing immediate plunder value might have treated all captives as interchangeable slave labor. Genseric's apparent interest in specifically identifying and capturing individuals with particular professional expertise suggests a longer-term strategic vision focused on building genuine institutional and infrastructural capacity within his own kingdom, using Roman human capital as a deliberate tool toward that broader developmental objective. Among the notable individual captives taken during this period was Gaudentius, the son of the murdered general Aetius, whose father's assassination had, as established in earlier episodes, set in motion the entire catastrophic chain of events, culminating in the sack itself, a detail that adds yet another layer of tragic historical irony to the broader narrative, as the son of the very general whose death had fatally weakened Rome's capacity to resist exactly this kind of catastrophe now found himself among its direct human casualties, carried away into captivity in the aftermath of a crisis his father's murder had helped precipitate. Beyond these specifically targeted higher-status captives, historical accounts describe tens of thousands of ordinary Roman citizens, young men and women without particular political significance or specialized professional skill, but whose youth and physical capability made them valuable simply as enslaved labor, being rounded up and transported aboard the Vandal fleet's ships for eventual sale within the broader Mediterranean slave trade, an economic institution that remained, throughout this period of late antiquity, a thoroughly normalized and economically significant feature of Mediterranean commercial life, regardless of which particular power happened to be conducting any specific instance of mass enslavement. Ancient accounts describing the scenes at Ostia's harbour as this human cargo was loaded aboard the departing Vandal fleet preserve details of genuine, visceral human tragedy that transcend the broader strategic and administrative framework within which this entire episode has otherwise been analysed. Families forcibly separated as individual members were assigned to different ships bound for different eventual destinations across the Mediterranean slave markets, with those being torn apart from spouses, parents, and children understanding, in many cases, that this separation was likely to prove permanent, given the practical realities of how difficult reunion would prove for individuals scattered across a slave trade network spanning the length and breadth of the Mediterranean basin. It is worth emphasizing, in concluding this particular dimension of the broader narrative, that despite the genuine scale of human suffering involved in this mass captivity and enslavement, the specific negotiated terms Pope Leo had secured from Genseric prior to the city's capitulation were, according to the consistent weight of surviving historical evidence, actually honoured throughout the 14-day operation. There was no wholesale, indiscriminate massacre of Rome's civilian population, and the city itself was not set ablaze in the manner that had characterized certain other instances of ancient urban conquest, including elements of the earlier Visigothic sack under Alaric. Genseric's restraint on these specific points, whatever mixture of calculated self-interest and genuine deference to his negotiated agreement with Leo actually motivated it, meant that Rome, however thoroughly stripped of its accumulated material wealth, and however traumatized by the mass captivity and enslavement its population endured, survived this catastrophe as a physically intact city, its population diminished, and its treasury emptied, but its buildings, for the most part, still standing. This distinction between wholesale massacre and targeted, economically calculated enslavement matters for understanding the internal logic Genseric appears to have applied throughout the entire operation. Killing a captive population wastes an asset that selling or ransoming that same population could convert into ongoing economic value, whether through direct labor extraction back in the Vandal Kingdom or through sale within the broader Mediterranean slave markets that connected North Africa to buyers across the entire ancient world. The genuine human tragedy of families separated at Ostia's harbour, whatever the emotional weight that tragedy rightly carries in any honest reckoning with this period, unfolded within a broader system that Genseric was operating according to calculated economic logic rather than indiscriminate cruelty for its own sake. A distinction that does nothing to lessen the suffering involved, but that helps explain why the specific negotiated restraint Leo secured proved durable throughout the full 2 weeks of the operation, rather than collapsing into the kind of uncontrolled violence that so easily overtakes conquering armies once initial discipline begins to fray. When Genseric's fleet finally departed from the mouth of the Tiber after 14 days of systematic extraction, it carried what ancient and modern historians alike have consistently characterized as one of the single largest concentrations of transported wealth in the entire history of the ancient Mediterranean world. Gold, silver, precious artwork, sacred religious objects accumulated from multiple distinct conquest events spanning centuries, skilled captives, and tens of thousands of enslaved Roman citizens, all being carried westward across the Mediterranean toward Carthage and the ongoing consolidation of Genseric's North African kingdom. Not every ship in this heavily laden fleet completed the journey successfully. Ancient sources record that at least one vessel, reportedly carrying an especially valuable cargo of looted statuary and artistic treasures, was lost during the Mediterranean crossing, sinking beneath the waves and taking its irreplaceable cultural cargo down with it, a detail that adds a final, poignant layer of loss to the broader story, since whatever specific works of Roman artistic achievement that particular ship had carried were lost not to deliberate destruction by Vandal hands, as popular legend would eventually and inaccurately suggest regarding the broader sack, but to the simple indifferent hazards of ancient Mediterranean seafaring, a loss that modern archaeologists and art historians can only speculate about with considerable and understandable frustration, given how little specific information survives regarding exactly what irreplaceable works may have gone down with that particular vessel. Upon arrival in Carthage, Genseric moved quickly to consolidate the political and dynastic advantages his dramatic military and economic triumph had created. The captured imperial princess Eudocia, whose original betrothal to Genseric's son Genseric had been the diplomatic arrangement Petronius Maximus's political maneuvering had attempted to dissolve, the very cancellation that had helped precipitate Eudoxia's fateful appeal for Vandal military intervention in the first place, now found that betrothal not merely restored, but actually consummated, as Genseric proceeded with the marriage between Genseric and Eudocia despite, or perhaps precisely because of, the extraordinarily fraught and violent circumstances under which this dynastic connection had ultimately been secured. This marriage carried genuine and calculated political significance, extending well beyond simple personal or dynastic sentiment. By formally connecting his own royal line to the imperial Theodosian dynasty through Genseric's marriage to a genuine Roman princess, Genseric secured for his Vandal kingdom a form of legitimizing dynastic connection to Roman imperial authority that no amount of pure military conquest alone could have provided. A sophisticated exercise in political legitimation that reveals, once again, the calculated strategic intelligence underlying Genseric's entire approach to statecraft, extending well beyond the immediate, dramatic military and economic triumph of the Rome sack itself, into the longer-term project of establishing his kingdom's enduring legitimacy and prestige within the broader late-antique Mediterranean political order. Fortified by the sheer scale of accumulated Roman wealth now flowing into his kingdom's treasury, and by the enhanced dynastic prestige his family connection to the Theodosian imperial line now provided, Genseric's Vandal Kingdom entered a period of sustained economic and military preeminence within the Western Mediterranean that would persist for decades following the sack. Subsequent Roman military efforts to reclaim North Africa or otherwise punish the Vandal Kingdom for its role in the events of 455, including a major, elaborately organized joint expedition launched by the Eastern Roman Empire in 468 AD, involving a substantial fleet and considerable military and financial investment from the Eastern imperial government, met with catastrophic failure, as Genseric's forces decisively defeated this Eastern Roman intervention through a combination of naval tactics, including the deployment of fire ships against the assembled Roman fleet, and continued strategic acumen that had, by this point in his long reign, become his consistent hallmark across every major military and political challenge he had faced throughout his decades in power. For the city of Rome itself, meanwhile, the 14-day sack represented a wound whose consequences extended considerably beyond the immediate, dramatic trauma of the event itself. The systematic stripping of accumulated gold, silver, and portable wealth from the imperial palace, the aristocratic households, and the city's churches represented a genuinely catastrophic blow to whatever remained of the Western Roman imperial government's financial capacity. At a moment when that government's ability to fund and maintain effective military forces, pay administrative officials, and otherwise sustain the basic apparatus of imperial governance had already been severely and chronically compromised by decades of preceding territorial losses, economic contraction, and administrative dysfunction. Historians studying the final 2 decades of the Western Roman Empire's existence, between the 455 sack and the empire's ultimate formal dissolution in 476 AD, when the Germanic general Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and declined to appoint any successor, consistently identify the Vandal sack of Rome as one of the most significant contributing factors in this final terminal decline, though certainly not the sole cause of a collapse that had been building through many decades of accumulated structural weakness, extending back well before 455. The financial catastrophe of losing such a substantial concentration of accumulated wealth in a single 14-day period, combined with the ongoing loss of North Africa's critical grain revenue that Genseric's earlier conquest had already inflicted, left the Western Roman state in a condition of such severe and compounding financial exhaustion that its capacity to fund the military forces necessary for its own continued defense against the numerous other pressures still bearing down upon it from every direction had been, for all practical purposes, permanently and fatally compromised. For well over 1,000 years following the events of 455 AD, the Vandals occupied a position in European historical memory not fundamentally different from that of numerous other Germanic peoples who had participated in the broader collapse and transformation of the Western Roman Empire, remembered, where they were remembered at all, in any specific detail beyond general historical reference. Primarily as one among many Germanic kingdoms that had risen and eventually fallen during late antiquity, their specific name carrying no particular additional weight or negative connotation beyond whatever general association medieval and early modern European writers held regarding Germanic conquest of Roman territory more broadly. The word vandalism and the specific negative connotation of senseless, destructive violence that the term carries in virtually every modern language influenced by this particular etymological development did not exist at all throughout this entire span of 13 centuries. It is a considerably more recent linguistic invention than most people using the term today would likely assume, and its actual historical origin reveals a story disconnected from the documented conduct of the Vandals themselves in ways that most casual users of the word have never had occasion to learn. The term was coined in 1794 during the height of the French Revolution's most radical and violent phase by a French Catholic bishop named Henri Grégoire, who used the newly created word specifically to condemn the systematic destruction of churches, religious artwork, monuments, and other cultural and architectural heritage that revolutionary forces were conducting throughout France during this period, as part of the broader revolutionary project of dismantling the symbols and physical infrastructure of the Catholic Church's institutional authority and its historical association with the deposed French monarchy. Grégoire, seeking a suitably damning historical comparison to characterize what he regarded as this senseless, ideologically driven destruction of France's accumulated cultural and artistic patrimony, reached back to the distant memory of the Vandal Kingdom and its historical association, however loosely and inaccurately understood by this point, with the general category of Germanic peoples who had contributed to Rome's fall, invoking their name specifically because it had, by the late 18th century, become a generalized shorthand within educated European historical consciousness for the broader category of Germanic conquest and the imagined savagery popularly associated with it, rather than reflecting any specific, detailed historical knowledge of what the actual Vandal Kingdom under Genseric had or had not done during their brief but dramatic historical prominence. This is the specific historical irony at the center of the entire episode this series has been documenting in careful detail. The actual, well-documented historical record of Genseric's 14-day operation in Rome, as established across the preceding episodes through the surviving ancient accounts of the sack itself, reveals a systematic, calculated extraction of movable wealth conducted with notable administrative discipline, alongside deliberate efforts to preserve rather than destroy the city's architectural fabric and its valuable artistic patrimony, motivated overwhelmingly by acquisitive rather than purely destructive impulse. The Vandals did not, according to the weight of the actual historical evidence, smash Rome's statues. They carefully packed and shipped them to Carthage. They did not burn the city. They negotiated specific terms with Pope Leo I, explicitly designed to prevent exactly that outcome, and by the consistent testimony of the surviving sources, largely honored those negotiated terms throughout their 2 weeks of systematic plundering. Grégoire's 1794 coinage, whatever specific rhetorical and political purposes it served within the immediate context of his own contemporary critique of revolutionary excess in France, effectively retroactively assigned to an entire historical people a reputation for mindless, indiscriminate, destructive violence that the actual documented conduct of that people's most historically significant and consequential military campaign simply does not support. The Vandals, whose actual historical legacy involves a remarkably sophisticated, patient, multi-decade strategy of territorial conquest, naval development, and calculated political alliance building, culminating in one of the most methodically organized plunder operations documented anywhere in ancient or late antique history, found themselves permanently associated, through a linguistic accident occurring 13 centuries after their own historical prominence had ended, with precisely the kind of irrational, purposeless destruction that their actual conduct during the sack of Rome had specifically and deliberately avoided. It is worth noting in this context that considerably more destructive damage was inflicted upon Rome's physical, architectural, and artistic heritage across the centuries by other forces entirely disconnected from the Vandals, including, at various points, Roman authorities themselves, who frequently repurposed ancient monuments and buildings for construction material during the medieval period, along with the cumulative effects of neglect, natural disaster, and deliberate destruction carried out by various later conquerors and even by medieval and Renaissance-era Romans themselves, who often showed considerably less reverence for preserving classical antiquities than modern popular imagination assumes. Yet none of these considerably more destructive actors carry anything resembling the specific linguistic and reputational burden that attached itself through Gregoire's particular 18th century rhetorical choice, specifically and permanently to the Vandal name. The Vandal Kingdom that Genseric had built through decades of patient, calculated conquest, and that the wealth extracted from Rome in 455 had helped fortify into one of the Western Mediterranean's most formidable powers for the following generation, did not prove to be a permanent historical fixture. Genseric himself died in 477 AD, having outlived the Western Roman Empire he had done so much to fatally weaken by roughly a single year, and his kingdom, while remaining a significant regional power for several additional decades under his successors, gradually experienced the kind of internal political instability, dynastic conflict, and religious tension between the ruling Vandal Arian Christian minority and the larger Nicene Christian population of North Africa that would eventually leave the kingdom critically vulnerable to external intervention. That intervention arrived in 533 AD, when the Eastern Roman Empire, by this point increasingly referred to by modern historians as the Byzantine Empire, though its own inhabitants continued to consider themselves simply Romans, launched a major military campaign under the command of the general Belisarius, one of the most brilliant military commanders of the entire late antique period, whose broader career would include the reconquest of substantial portions of the former Western Roman Empire's territory as part of the Eastern Emperor Justinian's ambitious and partially successful project of restoring unified Roman imperial authority over the Mediterranean world. Belisarius's campaign against the Vandal Kingdom proved swift and decisively successful, defeating Vandal forces in a series of engagements and effectively dismantling the kingdom that Genseric had spent decades constructing within the span of less than a year. Among the specific and historically resonant consequences of this Byzantine reconquest was the recovery of the treasures originally plundered from Rome in 455, including the sacred Jewish ceremonial objects that had already, by this point, survived two separate acts of conquest-driven displacement, first from Jerusalem to Rome under Titus in 70 AD, then from Rome to Carthage under Genseric in 455, and that were now transported yet again, this time to Constantinople, the Eastern Roman capital, as part of Belisarius's triumphal procession celebrating his North African victory. The surviving Vandal population, following the kingdom's final military and political collapse, experienced a rapid and largely complete dissolution of their distinct historical and cultural identity, absorbed through some combination of death in the continuing warfare, enslavement, and gradual cultural assimilation into the broader populations of North Africa and the wider Mediterranean world, to the point where no clearly identifiable Vandal population, language, or distinct cultural tradition survived as a recognizable entity into the subsequent medieval period, a fate broadly similar to that experienced by numerous other Germanic peoples, whose historical prominence during the turbulent centuries of late antique political transformation did not translate into permanent, enduring political or cultural survival. What did survive, with a persistence and cultural weight that Genseric himself could scarcely have anticipated or intended, was the historical memory of those 14 days in Rome during the summer of 455, a memory that would eventually, through the specific and largely accidental circumstances of Henri Grégoire's 1794 linguistic innovation, attach itself permanently to the Vandal name in a form disconnected from the actual, carefully documented historical conduct of the sack itself. Today, when a news broadcast anywhere in the English-speaking world, or in virtually any other language whose vocabulary has been shaped by this same historical linguistic development, describes an act of senseless property destruction, a smashed shop window, spray-painted graffiti on a public monument, a vehicle destroyed by random, purposeless violence, as an act of vandalism, That word carries within it a historical irony that few speakers using it casually have any occasion to recognize or reflect upon. The actual historical Vandals, as this series has documented across the preceding 9 episodes, conducted what remains one of the most methodically organized, administratively disciplined, and calculatedly restrained plunder operations documented anywhere in the historical record of ancient and late antique urban conquest. An operation motivated overwhelmingly by acquisitive economic and political calculation, rather than by any purposeless destructive impulse. Conducted under a negotiated agreement, specifically designed to preserve, rather than destroy, the conquered city's population and physical fabric, and executed with a level of logistical sophistication, systematic organization, and calculated long-term strategic thinking that stands in genuine, almost complete contrast to the modern connotation their name would eventually, and largely inaccurately, come to represent. This is, in its own way, one of history's more instructive and genuinely thought-provoking ironies. An entire historical people, whose actual documented conduct during their single most consequential and historically significant military campaign reflected calculated discipline and deliberate restraint rather than senseless destruction, found their name permanently repurposed, more than 13 centuries after the fact, to describe precisely the opposite kind of behavior from what they had actually, carefully, and deliberately practiced. The Vandals did not smash Rome. They audited it, catalogued it, and shipped it away in an orderly 14-day operation, conducted under a negotiated treaty with the city's own religious leadership. History, or more precisely the specific rhetorical needs of a French bishop confronting revolutionary chaos 13 centuries later, simply decided to remember it otherwise, and that remembered version, however historically inaccurate, is the one that has endured, embedded permanently within the vocabulary of every language it subsequently touched, long after the actual historical record it was supposedly describing had faded into the kind of specialized academic knowledge that only careful historical investigation, like the one this series has attempted to provide, can fully recover and set straight. Perhaps the final, most durable lesson this entire episode offers has less to do with the Vandals themselves than with the fragile, unpredictable mechanics of historical memory more broadly. What actually happened in Rome across those 14 days in June of 455? The careful negotiation, the disciplined administrative extraction, the calculated restraint that spared the city's population and its physical fabric even while stripping it of centuries of accumulated wealth, required patient archival and archaeological work to reconstruct with any real accuracy, work that most people encountering the word vandalism in ordinary daily conversation will never have occasion to undertake or even suspect exists. Meanwhile, the version of events a single 18th century bishop constructed for his own immediate rhetorical purposes, disconnected from the documented conduct of the people he named, achieved a permanence and global reach the actual historical record itself never managed on its own. Names outlive nuance. Convenient comparisons outlive careful research. And sometimes, the reputation a people carries through subsequent history has less to do with what they actually did than with who found their name useful, for entirely unrelated purposes, more than 1,000 years after they themselves had already vanished from the world.